Hello everyone. I'm Daisy, a mother, grandmother, and storyteller of life's hardest truths. Here I share raw and emotional stories of betrayal, heartbreak, true crime, and family conflict. These are tales of shocking cruelty, painful revelations, and the resilience it takes to heal. If you've ever been hurt by those you trusted most, you're not alone. Broken heart, subscribe and join me on this journey of truth, strength, and survival. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes, it comes from the person sleeping right beside you. This is the chilling story of a woman who uncovered her husband's shocking plan. A plan that could have cost her everything. But fate had its own way of turning the tables. They met in the kind of way people always say is fate. He was charming, attentive, and seemed to know exactly what to say to make her feel special. Friends would often comment on how lucky she was to have found a man who opened doors for her, remembered the little details, and never forgot an anniversary. In those early days, it felt like a dream that had come true. A whirlwind romance that seemed too perfect to be real. They laughed together, traveled together, and built the kind of memories most couples only dream of. It was the picture of a perfect marriage, the type of relationship people point to when they want to believe love conquers all. Their wedding was a storybook day, the kind people still mention years later. The photographs showed them smiling with such radiance that no one could have guessed what shadows might one day creep into their lives. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world, and she believed with her whole heart that he would protect her, cherish her, and love her without limits. When they exchanged vows, her hands shook not from fear but from overwhelming joy, certain that she was stepping into a forever that nothing could break. The years that followed only deepened that image of perfection. To neighbors and family, they were the golden couple. They bought a modest but beautiful home, painted the rooms together, and filled the space with laughter and warmth. Holiday dinners were lively, with him standing at her side, hand resting protectively at the small of her back as if to say, "She's mine and I'll always keep her safe." On anniversaries, he would surprise her with flowers or small, thoughtful gifts, tokens that reminded her she was loved. When friends asked how married life was, she would smile and say she couldn't have asked for better. To her children, he was the dependable father figure, the man who never missed a school play or a soccer game. He made jokes at the dinner table that had everyone laughing. He fixed broken toys and read bedtime stories, weaving himself into the fabric of family life so seamlessly that no one ever thought to question his intentions. To the outside world, there was no hint of discontent. He was steady, reliable, and above all, convincing in his role as the perfect husband. Behind closed doors, however, there were tiny signs, so small that at first they seemed unimportant. A sharp tone when he thought no one was listening. A lingering look of impatience when she talked about her dreams or fears. A coldness that passed as quickly as it appeared. Always smoothed over with a smile or an apology. She chalked it up to stress, to the challenges of life and work. Everyone had bad days, she told herself, and marriage wasn't always going to be flawless. Still, the doubts were fleeting, drowned out by the good moments that made her believe in the strength of their bond. Money was always a sensitive subject, but isn't it for every couple? They wanted more than they had, and though she thought they were doing well enough, he was always chasing something bigger, something better. He wanted the nicer car, the bigger house, the kind of lifestyle that told the world they had made it. She admired his ambition, even when it made her uneasy. He would tell her not to worry, that he had plans, that one day she would be living in the comfort and security she deserved. She believed him because she wanted to. She trusted him because that was what love was supposed to be. As the years passed, life settled into a routine. She worked hard, cared for the children, and made their home a place filled with warmth and stability. He provided, made promises of a brighter future, and maintained the charm that had drawn her in from the start. When she looked at him across the dinner table, she still saw the man who had swept her off her feet, the one who had whispered promises of forever into her ear on their wedding day. Family and friends never stopped admiring them. At gatherings, people would say things like, "You two are perfect together," or, "I hope my marriage looks like yours one day." She would smile, not realizing how deeply those words would cut her years later. She believed them too, in a way. Believed that despite the occasional tension, theirs was a love strong enough to endure. After all, every marriage has its struggles. What mattered was that they faced them together, or so she thought. In her heart, she still held on to the belief that she was safe with him. He was her partner, her confidant, her protector. She never imagined that the very man who once held her close during storms, who kissed her forehead when she was tired, would one day become the source of her greatest danger. The idea that the love of her life could ever betray her so deeply was unthinkable. If anyone had suggested it back then, she would have laughed and shaken her head. Not him, not the man who had promised her the world. Looking back, it's easy to see how the pieces didn't quite fit, how the mask he wore was already beginning to slip. But in the moment, she saw only what she wanted to see. The dream she had built around them, the life she believed was real. She had invested too much hope, too much love, to imagine it was all an illusion. The cracks were there, but she smoothed them over, convinced that love was stronger than anything that threatened it. In those early years, her world was defined by trust. Trust that he meant the words he said. Trust that the hand he held out to her was steady and true. Trust that he was building a future for them, not against them. She didn't know then that every smile, every gesture, every sweet word was part of a carefully constructed facade. A mask designed to keep her from ever suspecting the darkness that hid beneath. This was the life she believed in, the perfect marriage. A love story that began like a fairy tale, filled with laughter, companionship, and dreams of forever. It was the foundation on which she built her life, the anchor she held on to when the world felt uncertain. What she didn't know was that the very foundation she trusted so completely was already cracking beneath her feet. One day it would crumble entirely, and the man she thought she knew would reveal a truth more devastating than any nightmare she could have imagined. For now, though, in this first chapter of her story, she was still living in that illusion. Still clinging to the picture of a perfect marriage. Still blinded by love, unaware that the man who smiled beside her in photographs and whispered promises in the dark was already planning a betrayal so cruel, it would nearly cost her everything, including her life. At first, the struggles seemed ordinary, the kind of challenges any couple might face. Bills arrived at the same time every month, and while she carefully budgeted to stretch every dollar, he always seemed restless, unsatisfied with what they had. Their modest home was warm and welcoming, but to him it was never enough. He would point out houses in the nicer neighborhoods, the ones with long driveways and manicured lawns, and say one day they would live there. She admired his ambition, but the way his eyes lingered on those houses made her uneasy, as if what they had together would never satisfy him. Work was another source of tension. He often complained about his job, about the long hours and the lack of recognition. He dreamed of running his own business or striking it rich with a big idea, but none of those dreams ever materialized. Each failure left him angrier, more bitter, and though he tried to mask it, the frustration seeped into their home. She encouraged him, reminding him that success takes time, but the more she tried to reassure him, the more he pulled away, as if her words weren't comfort but condemnation. Money became the silent wedge between them. She managed the household carefully, making sure the children had what they needed, but he wanted more: nicer clothes, fancier dinners, a life that showed the world he had made it. When she hesitated, reminding him of their budget, he would grow cold, accusing her of holding him back. Arguments flared, never loud enough for neighbors to hear, but sharp enough to leave her shaken. The man who once showered her with affection was now showing flashes of a temper that frightened her, though she told herself it was just stress, nothing more. She began to notice other changes too. The way he spent more time out of the house, claiming late nights at work or errands that never quite added up. The way he guarded his phone, angling the screen away from her as if he had something to hide. When she asked, he would brush her off with a laugh, telling her she was imagining things. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because to accept anything else would mean questioning the foundation of their marriage. What unsettled her most was the growing distance. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt strained, punctuated by long silences. He no longer asked about her day, or listened when she shared her worries. When she reached for his hand at night, sometimes he pulled away, leaving her to wonder what had changed. In public, he was still the same attentive husband, smiling for photographs and playing the part, but behind closed doors, he was slipping further and further from her grasp. The children sensed it too. They didn't have the words to explain, but they noticed the tension. They would ask why Daddy seemed upset, and she would smile, brushing it off as a bad day. She worked hard to shield them from the cracks appearing in their family, determined to preserve the illusion of stability. She told herself that every marriage goes through rough patches, that if she held on a little longer, things would get better. But in her heart a quiet fear began to grow, whispering that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just money or stress. It was the way he looked at her sometimes, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not sadness, but something colder, as if he was evaluating her, calculating in a way that made her shiver. The man who once called her his everything now seemed to look through her, as though she was part of an equation he was trying to solve. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside. She had built her life around this marriage, devoted years to it, and the idea of it unraveling was too painful to face. Instead, she told herself he was under pressure, that his dreams had not yet come true, that once he found success, the man she loved would return to her fully. She believed that love could overcome whatever shadow was creeping into their home. But the hidden struggles grew heavier with time. Small lies began to surface. Receipts that didn't match his stories, unexplained withdrawals from their account, whispered conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room. Each discovery chipped away at her trust, yet she clung to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding. She wanted so badly to believe in the man she had married, the one who had once made her feel safe. Her own health began to suffer under the weight of it all. Sleepless nights left her exhausted, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. She felt alone, even when he was beside her. Friends noticed the change, asking if she was all right, but she brushed them off with practiced smiles, insisting everything was fine. She couldn't admit the truth, not even to herself, that the life she thought was so solid was starting to crack beneath her feet. And yet, despite the doubts, she still loved him. Love is complicated that way. It clings to memories, to moments of tenderness, to the belief that the person you chose is still in there somewhere. She told herself that every couple has struggles, that she had to be patient, that things would improve once they weathered this storm. What she didn't know was that while she was fighting to hold the marriage together, he was already planning something far darker. For him, the struggles weren't just obstacles, they were fuel. The financial pressures, the disappointment of dreams unfulfilled, the hunger for a better life. These became justifications in his mind. He began to see her not as his partner, not as the woman he had once sworn to protect, but as the solution to his problems. While she stayed awake at night worrying about their future, he was already imagining a different kind of future, one where her absence meant his gain. The hidden struggles weren't just cracks in a marriage, they were warning signs of something sinister taking root. But she didn't see it yet. How could she? She was blinded by love, by loyalty, by the belief that marriage vows were unbreakable. She thought they were just weathering the kind of storm all couples face, not realizing that the man she trusted most was already turning those struggles into a weapon against her. In her heart, she still held on to hope. Hope that they would rebuild, that his smile would return, that the laughter they once shared would fill their home again. She clung to that hope even as the shadows deepened, unaware that those hidden struggles were not temporary hardships, but the beginning of a betrayal so profound it would change her life forever. It started innocently enough, at least that's how it appeared. He presented the idea as though it came from a place of love, a natural step for a responsible husband and father who wanted to protect his family. They had been married long enough that talk of security and the future was normal, even expected. He sat her down one evening and spoke about the uncertainties of life, about how unpredictable the world could be. What if something happened to him, he asked gently, wouldn't she and the children need protection? It was a reasonable question, and she nodded along, relieved to hear him thinking about their long-term stability. The way he framed it, the life insurance policy was an act of devotion. It was about safeguarding the children's future, ensuring they would never struggle if tragedy struck. He spoke with such conviction that she felt guilty for not having suggested it herself. Of course it made sense. Responsible families did this all the time. She trusted him, trusted his reasoning, and believed that every word came from a place of genuine care. She signed where he told her to sign, never imagining that her own name on those papers was sealing her fate in ways she could not yet comprehend. At first she thought little of it. The policy was filed away with other documents, another layer of security tucked into the life they were building. But soon she began to notice how often he brought it up. He would casually mention the payout, remarking on how much stability it would bring if the worst ever happened. His words lingered in her mind longer than she wanted them to. Most people buy insurance and then forget about it, a safety net no one hopes to need. But for him it became a topic of conversation that returned again and again, like a shadow that never fully disappeared. His focus on it unsettled her, though she told herself she was imagining things. After all, what husband wouldn't want to be sure his family was provided for? Maybe he was just being thorough, making certain she understood the importance of planning ahead. Still, the way he spoke about it sometimes made her uneasy. There was a tone she couldn't quite place, as though he was less concerned with protection and more fascinated by the promise of money. She pushed the thought away, ashamed of her own suspicion. She didn't want to believe he could ever have ulterior motives. But as the weeks passed, the pattern became harder to ignore. He began to ask about her health in ways that didn't feel like love. If she caught a cold, his questions about whether she had seen a doctor seemed more like assessments than concern. If she mentioned feeling tired, he would remind her of how fragile life could be. Once, when she teased about how clumsy she was, he laughed a little too hard, telling her she ought to be careful given how much she was worth now. It was said as a joke, but something in his eyes made her shiver. The insurance policy had shifted something between them, though she couldn't explain it clearly. She felt as though a clock had started ticking, one she hadn't known existed before. He began to manage their finances differently, keeping closer tabs on accounts, asking about her routines in more detail than before. He wanted to know when she left the house, when she came back, when she went shopping. On the surface it looked like attentiveness, but in her gut it felt like something else, like surveillance. She reminded herself that paranoia wasn't fair. He was her husband. He was the father of her children. They had built a life together, and he had always been there for her. Yet the more she tried to convince herself, the more her unease grew. The policy was supposed to bring peace of mind, but instead it had become a source of quiet fear, a thread of anxiety that tugged at her day and night. When she brought it up, he was quick to soothe her worries. He brushed off her concerns with a laugh, calling her imaginative, telling her she watched too many crime shows. He would hold her hand, look her in the eyes, and assure her that everything he did was for their family. His words were smooth, convincing, the same way they had been when he first charmed her years ago. She wanted so badly to believe him that she let his reassurances wash over her, even though deep down, the fear never truly disappeared. The truth was that the policy had awakened something in him, something darker than she realized. For her it was security. For him it was possibility. He began to see the numbers attached to her life not as protection but as opportunity. He had always wanted more. More money, more success, more status, and now right in front of him was a solution to every frustration he had ever voiced. In his mind, her death became the answer to his problems, and the insurance policy was the key that unlocked that door. Meanwhile, she carried on, unaware of just how far his thoughts had drifted. She still tried to preserve their marriage, still tried to keep the family together, even as the distance between them grew. The insurance policy was filed away in her mind, a source of unease she couldn't shake, but she never allowed herself to consider that it might be the very thing that would one day put her life in danger. She told herself that husbands don't plot against their wives, that partners don't betray the people they've vowed to love. Her trust, though fragile, still blinded her to the truth. The policy became a silent character in their home, invisible yet always present. Every time she caught him looking at her with that strange, unreadable expression, she wondered if she was imagining things. Every time he brought up the future in vague, detached terms, she felt a chill run through her. And yet she said nothing. She kept moving forward, clinging to the hope that she was wrong, that her fears were nothing more than shadows in her mind. But in reality, those papers she had signed so willingly were now the blueprint for betrayal. What she thought was love expressed through protection was, in his eyes, a contract that set the price of her life. The moment the ink dried, the balance of their marriage shifted forever. She had signed away more than she realized, her peace, her trust, and unknowingly the very safety she believed she had secured. The insurance policy was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a weapon. It was a motive. It was the spark that would turn hidden struggles into something much darker, something that would push him to cross a line she never thought possible. It began subtly, in ways so small she almost missed them. A change in the rhythm of their daily life, a shift in his demeanor that seemed harmless at first. He started asking more questions about her routine, casual inquiries that didn't appear unusual on the surface. What time would she be home? How long would she be at the store? Who was she meeting for lunch? At first she thought it was care, the interest of a husband wanting to stay connected. But over time the questions grew sharper, more precise, as though he was keeping track of every movement. He also became more guarded. The man who once shared everything with her now seemed to live behind a locked door. His phone, once left on counters or coffee tables, never left his side. He angled the screen away from her, silenced calls when she entered the room, and brushed off her questions with jokes about privacy. His computer password changed without explanation, and she noticed him shutting his laptop quickly whenever she walked in. When she asked what he was working on, his answers were vague, dismissive, sometimes tinged with irritation, as though her curiosity was an intrusion. The warmth he had once shown her began to flicker and fade. Small gestures of affection grew rare. He stopped reaching for her hand in public, stopped wrapping his arm around her when they sat together. At night, he turned away from her in bed, claiming exhaustion. She missed the intimacy they once shared, the closeness that made her feel safe. Now there was distance, a wall she couldn't scale, and the more she tried to break through, the higher he seemed to build it. His temper, too, began to surface in ways that unsettled her. He snapped over trivial things, misplaced keys, a forgotten chore, the way she folded the laundry. The man who once teased her gently now cut her down with words that stung. The apologies that used to follow were less frequent, replaced instead with excuses. He was stressed, he said. Work was overwhelming. Life was unfair. She wanted to believe him, to accept that pressure was making him act out, but the coldness in his eyes when he lashed out felt different. It was not the frustration of a man under strain. It was detachment, as if he no longer cared about the damage his words caused. Even his habits changed. He began to take long drives at night, claiming he needed to clear his head. He would return hours later, smelling faintly of alcohol, though not enough to suggest he'd been at a bar. Sometimes his clothes carried a different scent, cologne that wasn't his, perfume that wasn't hers. When she asked where he had gone, he offered vague answers, just out, or nowhere important. He dismissed her concerns, but his evasiveness only deepened her unease. There were moments when she caught him staring at her, eyes lingering in a way that made her uncomfortable. It wasn't admiration, not the look of a man in love. It was colder, calculating, like someone studying a puzzle he was determined to solve. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself she was overthinking, but the unease gnawed at her. The gaze felt more like evaluation than affection, as if he were weighing her presence, measuring her worth in ways she couldn't understand. Her instincts told her something was wrong, but she silenced them. She reminded herself that marriage had ups and downs, that stress could change a person, that he was still her husband, the father of her children. She clung to the memory of who he had been, hoping that man would return. But the more she tried to excuse his behavior, the more glaring the changes became. Financial matters added to her worries. He grew secretive about their accounts, insisting on handling bills himself. When she asked questions, he grew defensive, sometimes angry. Once she discovered a credit card statement tucked away, filled with charges she couldn't explain. Restaurants she hadn't been to, purchases she didn't recognize. When she confronted him, he brushed it off as business expenses or gifts for colleagues. His explanations were smooth, convincing on the surface, but something about them rang hollow. She felt like she was standing on shifting ground, never quite sure what was real anymore. There were also the strange accidents that began to happen, incidents she brushed off at first but later remembered with a chill. A gas burner left on without a flame. A loose step on the stairs that hadn't been loose before. A car tire that went flat in the middle of nowhere, though it had been fine the night before. Each time he had an explanation, a shrug, a calm assurance that it was nothing. But the more these things happened, the more she felt as though she were walking through a maze where every corner held a hidden threat. Her body began to respond to the stress in ways she couldn't ignore. Headaches, sleepless nights, a constant tightness in her chest. She felt watched even when she was alone, as if his presence lingered around her. She no longer felt at ease in her own home. The walls that once sheltered her now seemed to close in, filled with silence that was heavier than words. Friends noticed the change in her, the way her laughter seemed forced, the way her eyes darted when he was near. They asked if everything was all right, but she insisted it was fine. How could she tell them the truth when she wasn't even sure what the truth was? To admit her suspicions felt like a betrayal of the man she had vowed to stand beside, even if he had already begun betraying her in ways she could not yet prove. Her children sensed it too. They grew quieter around him, cautious in a way they hadn't been before. The tension in the air was something they couldn't put into words, but they felt it all the same. She tried to protect them, to shield them from the growing cracks in their family, but even her best efforts couldn't erase the unease that had settled into their home. The strangeness of his behavior was no longer subtle. It had become a pattern, a chilling transformation that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. The man who once filled her life with warmth now brought a chill that seeped into every corner of her being. She told herself it was temporary, that it would pass, but deep down she knew this was no passing storm. Something darker had taken root, and the husband she thought she knew was slipping further and further away. What she didn't yet realize was that his strange behavior was not random, not meaningless. Every question about her routine, every guarded secret, every cold look was part of a larger plan. A plan that had been set into motion the day she signed that policy. The changes she saw in him were not just signs of stress, they were signs of intent. And while she still clung to hope, he was already calculating the end. The days that followed Rebecca's discovery of her brother's betrayal unfolded like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her life, which had already been filled with struggle, felt as though it had been set ablaze, leaving behind only ashes of what she thought was family loyalty. At first, she tried to reason with herself, hoping there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding that could explain why Daniel had taken everything. But as each detail surfaced, the forged signatures, the false promises, the cunning manipulation of their mother's estate, there was no escaping the truth. He had not only stolen her inheritance, but he had also stolen her sense of safety, her trust in blood ties, and her belief that family was a sanctuary. The weight of betrayal pressed down on Rebecca's chest like an immovable stone. Every morning she woke with a hollow ache that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. She could no longer walk through the house without seeing his fingerprints on her pane. Documents left unsigned, bills piling up, furniture she had been forced to sell just to keep the lights on. Even the pictures on the wall seemed to mock her. Smiling family portraits that once captured moments of innocence, but now felt like evidence of a life built on lies. Daniel had not just taken money. He had dismantled the very foundation of her world. Rebecca tried to push forward, but the silence of her home grew unbearable. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake, her mind looping through endless questions with no answers. How long had Daniel planned this? Did he ever love her as a sister, or had every kind word been nothing more than a mask to hide his greed? Her mother's memory, once a source of comfort, now brought a new kind of pain. Their mother had trusted Daniel too, and that trust had been weaponized against both of them. The grief of losing her mother was compounded by the agony of realizing her brother had destroyed her mother's legacy. It wasn't just financial loss that crushed Rebecca. It was the humiliation. Friends she had trusted began to distance themselves once whispers spread about the family scandal. Some assumed she had mismanaged her share. Others pitted her with condescending glances, but very few believed the truth of her brother's betrayal. Reputation, once carefully protected, was now another casualty of Daniel's actions. And Rebecca was left to carry the burden of both shame and survival, standing alone while the man who had caused it all carried on as though nothing had happened. But as the weight grew heavier, something else began to stir within Rebecca. Pain often sharpens resolve, and in her despair, she began to feel the first sparks of determination. She was tired of being the victim in Daniel's twisted game. If he thought she would simply fade into silence, he was wrong. A lifetime of resilience, shaped by hardship, by raising her children, by fighting through loss, would not be undone by her brother's cruelty. She began to dig deeper into the paper trail he had left behind, determined to find the proof that would expose him. Her research became a lifeline. She spent long nights combing through bank statements, legal documents, and property records, piecing together the puzzle of his deception. The more she uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Daniel had built a facade of respectability, while exploiting every loophole and trust placed in him. It was not a single mistake, it was a pattern, a deliberate orchestration of fraud. What Rebecca uncovered was not just betrayal but a crime. Still, the road to justice was not simple. Lawyers were expensive, and Rebecca barely had enough to cover rent. Each phone call to a potential attorney ended the same way. A polite dismissal once they realized how little she could pay. The system, like her brother, seemed stacked against her. Yet she refused to stop. Even if she couldn't yet fight him in court, she would fight in spirit, refusing to let his betrayal consume her completely. At the same time, the emotional scars deepened. Family gatherings became battlegrounds of unspoken tension. Cousins who once laughed at the dinner table now avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the conflict that had splintered their family tree. Some took Daniel's side, swayed by his charm and carefully constructed lies. Others stayed neutral, unwilling to get involved. But the ones who mattered most, her children, stood beside Rebecca unwaveringly. They had seen her struggle firsthand, and their loyalty became the anchor keeping her from drifting too far into despair. Her grandchildren, too young to understand the full depth of the betrayal, brought her fleeting moments of light. Their laughter, their small hands reaching for hers, reminded Rebecca of what truly mattered. Daniel could strip her of money and reputation, but he could not erase the love she had built within her own branch of the family. That realization became the seed of her strength. The community, however, was less forgiving. Rumors spread like wildfire, twisting the story into a spectacle. Some whispered that Rebecca had been careless, that she should have known better than to trust her brother with finances. Others speculated darkly that she was exaggerating, seeking sympathy where none was deserved. Each whisper cut deeper, not because they believed Daniel's lies, but because they revealed how quickly people turned their backs when scandal tainted a family name. But Rebecca knew one thing for certain. Silence would not heal her, and acceptance would not restore what was taken. She had to confront the darkness head-on, even if it meant standing alone. The betrayal had nearly broken her, but in its wake, she found something stronger than bitterness. She found clarity. She now saw her brother for who he truly was, not the protective sibling of her childhood memories, but a manipulator who preyed on trust. And knowing the truth, no matter how painful, was the first step toward reclaiming her power. The struggle was far from over, but Rebecca's resolve hardened with each passing day. She knew the path ahead would demand strength she wasn't sure she still possessed, but she also knew surrender was not an option. Too much had been stolen already, and she would not let Daniel's betrayal define the rest of her life. For every wound he had inflicted, she would rise with purpose. And though the shadows of heartbreak loomed over her, she began to believe that even the deepest pain could be transformed into a source of unshakable resilience. What had begun as devastation was quietly shaping into a battle. Not just for money, not just for justice, but for dignity, truth, and the preservation of her family's story. Rebecca had been pushed to the edge, but instead of falling, she was preparing to fight back. And as the weight of betrayal pressed down, she discovered within herself a strength she never knew she had. The strength to rise from the ashes of what Daniel had destroyed. The unraveling of the truth did not come with a thunderclap but with a slow, almost suffocating quiet that seeped into every part of the family's life. It began in whispers, the kind that trickled through conversations at church gatherings, over fences between neighbors, or in the subtle looks exchanged at the grocery store. The town, which had once revered the family for their supposed unity and reputation, now became a stage where suspicion played out in plain sight. Every smile seemed forced, every greeting laced with an unspoken awareness that something had shifted behind the closed doors of their home. For Daisy, the weight of the revelations sat heavily on her shoulders. She had lived through betrayal before, but this was different. This was not just the breaking of trust, it was the shattering of the very foundation on which her family had stood. What had once been a home full of laughter, grandchildren's giggles, and shared meals now felt more like a courtroom, where every glance was an accusation and every silence was a verdict. The walls seemed to absorb the tension, holding it like a secret too heavy to release. The children were not immune to it either. They picked up on the subtle changes, the sharpness in voices that used to be warm, the way certain names were spoken with bitterness instead of love, the cold distance that separated rooms that once flowed with conversation. Questions began to surface in innocent tones, the kind only a child could ask, and those questions cut deeper than any accusation from an adult ever could. Why doesn't Uncle come over anymore? Why does Mommy cry at night? Why do people look at us funny? Each question was a mirror reflecting back the pain the adults tried desperately to mask. The truth that had begun to emerge was not only about financial betrayal but about moral decay. It became clear that the greed which had driven certain family members went deeper than just money. It was tied to pride, envy, and the need for control. They were not content with what they had. They wanted to dominate, to be the center of power, to hold others in their grip. And in their pursuit of this dominance, they had crossed lines that should never be crossed. Documents surfaced, each one like a dagger. Bank statements hidden away in locked drawers, signed agreements that had been deliberately kept from Daisy, and even recordings that revealed conversations dripping with deceit. The evidence was undeniable, and with each piece Daisy's heart sank lower. It wasn't just about money. It was about the realization that those she had once cradled in her arms, nurtured and sacrificed for could grow into people capable of such cruelty. But betrayal has a way of forcing strength where none seemed possible. Daisy began to steel herself, not because she wanted to fight, but because survival demanded it. She had to think not only of herself but of the grandchildren who still looked to her with trust, who still saw her as the safe place in a world that now felt uncertain. She could not allow the sins of others to define the future of the innocent. As the conflict deepened, sides began to form. Family members who once celebrated birthdays together now found themselves divided. Some stood firmly with Daisy, unwilling to accept lies as truth, while others clung to the ones who had betrayed, either out of fear, loyalty, or shared guilt. The fractures widened, and soon family gatherings were nothing but a memory. Holidays passed with empty chairs and unanswered invitations, and the once tight web of kinship unraveled thread by painful thread. In the midst of this storm, Daisy found herself confronting memories that had long been tucked away. She recalled sacrifices made, late nights working to provide, moments when she put her dreams aside for the sake of her children, times when she endured silently so they could thrive. To think that all of it had led to this, a battlefield of mistrust and cruelty, was almost unbearable. Yet in that reflection also came resolve. If she had endured before, she could endure again. The betrayal also began to ripple into the community. Friends who had once admired the family now questioned their own relationships with them. People wondered how much of what they had seen over the years was real and how much was a facade. It was humiliating for Daisy, who had always carried herself with grace and dignity, to be seen through the lens of scandal. Yet even in her humiliation, she refused to let shame consume her. The shame did not belong to her. It belonged to those who had chosen deception. But the most difficult part came in facing her grandchildren. They were too young to understand the complexities of betrayal, too innocent to grasp the depth of manipulation and greed. For them it was simple. People they loved were no longer speaking, and the world they knew was changing. Daisy became their anchor, the one who answered their questions with gentleness, even when her heart was breaking. She shielded them from the ugliest details, determined to preserve their childhood for as long as possible. Yet beneath the heartbreak was a glimmer of strength. Daisy began to see herself not just as a victim but as a survivor. She understood that the truth, as painful as it was, also freed her. No longer could she be manipulated by lies. No longer could she be bound by false loyalties. The exposure of betrayal was devastating, but it also provided clarity. She could finally see who was truly for her and who was against her. The nights were the hardest. Alone with her thoughts, Daisy replayed the events over and over, wondering if she had missed the signs. She asked herself if she had been too forgiving, too trusting, too blind. The questions gnawed at her, but each morning she rose again, determined not to let despair claim her. She poured her energy into prayer, reflection, and quiet moments of strength, knowing that resilience was not born in ease but in trials such as this. Slowly she began to plan. Not for revenge but for renewal. She thought about how to rebuild her life, how to protect her peace, and how to ensure that future generations would not inherit the same cycle of betrayal. She began to dream again, not of grand things but of simple joys. A home filled with genuine love, laughter that rang true, and relationships built on honesty rather than obligation. Section 6 was not the end of the story but the turning point. It marked the place where the darkness of betrayal gave way to the first flickers of resilience. The storm had not passed, but Daisy had begun to find her footing within it. And though the wounds were deep, there was an undeniable strength growing in the cracks. Proof that even in the face of heartbreak, the human spirit has the power to endure, to rise, and to begin again. The seventh section of the story reveals the mounting tension between hope and despair, where the pursuit of truth has begun to crack open doors long kept locked. But those very doors carry shadows that threaten to swallow everything. As new evidence surfaced and witnesses emerged, the family felt both closer to justice and yet more vulnerable than ever. The weight of years of secrecy became almost unbearable, as if every revelation pulled at the threads of their lives, unraveling the image of unity they had tried so hard to preserve for the outside world. The discovery of bank transactions tied to suspicious accounts set off alarm bells. Money that was supposed to fund legitimate ventures had been siphoned off, leaving behind a trail of deceit that stretched further than anyone first believed. When the pattern was pieced together, it revealed a story not of simple betrayal but of calculated exploitation. This wasn't merely about greed. It was about power, control, and a cold disregard for family bonds. It was the kind of revelation that burned in the heart like acid, forcing everyone to confront the reality that the betrayal had been deliberate, not accidental. What made matters even more suffocating was the silence of those who knew more than they were willing to admit. Some family members remained tight-lipped, not out of ignorance but out of fear. Fear of repercussions, fear of shame, fear of being cut off from whatever fragile sense of belonging still lingered. Yet, that silence was as destructive as the betrayal itself. It allowed lies to breathe, to grow, and to shape the narrative in ways that blurred the line between victim and villain. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the betrayal extended beyond financial devastation. Friendships within the family collapsed under suspicion. Cousins who once played together became strangers, and long-held traditions began to feel hollow. Gatherings that were once marked by laughter turned into tense, awkward affairs where every glance seemed weighted with unspoken accusations. The very fabric of family identity was unraveling, replaced by a culture of suspicion that no amount of denial could repair. And yet, in the midst of all this decay, a flicker of determination began to grow. Certain members of the family, worn down by years of manipulation, finally found themselves unwilling to remain silent. They began speaking out, sharing pieces of the truth they had once hidden. Some revealed the backroom conversations they had overheard. Others admitted to signing documents they didn't fully understand, while a few confessed to being pressured into complicity. With every new confession, the picture grew sharper and uglier, but also more undeniable. As the pieces of truth fell into place, the betrayal was no longer an isolated act of cruelty. It became clear it was a system of abuse maintained for years. Lies had been told with confidence, masked as kindness, while cruelty had been dressed up as necessity. It was a betrayal so sophisticated that it had masqueraded as love. To admit this was devastating, but it was also liberating. Once the illusion shattered, there was no way to go back to blind acceptance. The family's fight for justice moved from whispers in private rooms to documented reports, legal consultations, and bold confrontations. Every step was laced with fear, but also with strength that none of them knew they possessed. For some, it felt like reclaiming stolen dignity, for others like standing up for those who no longer had a voice. Each step forward was a refusal to let betrayal define them entirely, a choice to rise even while carrying scars that would never fully heal. Still, the shadow of betrayal lingered, shaping their days with exhaustion. Nights were restless, haunted by thoughts of what had been lost and what still remained hidden. Even when progress was made, it was impossible to shake the question of how much deeper the deception went. There was always the chance that another secret would emerge, each one threatening to fracture the family further. The most haunting realization, however, was not about the betrayal itself but about the silence that allowed it. It wasn't just what was done that broke them, but how long it was permitted to continue without challenge. That silence, born from fear and denial, had become a prison of its own. To break free from it required not just uncovering the truth but reclaiming their courage to speak it, even when voices trembled and hands shook. By this stage, the family was no longer just reacting to betrayal. They were actively transforming under its weight. Pain had forced them to redefine what loyalty, love, and family truly meant. It was no longer about blood ties or obligations. It became about honesty, resilience, and the courage to face reality, however brutal. Though wounds remained open and raw, something unbreakable began to grow out of the ashes of trust. The journey was far from over. The revelations of Section 7 marked only a turning point, not a resolution. But in that turning point lay the heart of their transformation. They were no longer a family bound by denial, but a family bound by survival, truth, and the determination to rise above what had once destroyed them. As the trial date drew closer, the town seemed to split further apart. Conversations at grocery stores, whispered exchanges in coffee shops, and even heated arguments in church parking lots all revolved around one thing: the case. Some people refused to believe that Daniel could ever be capable of such a crime, while others insisted that the evidence, however fragile, pointed directly at him. Families argued over dinner tables, friendships fractured, and the quiet suburban neighborhood where Daniel's mother still lived became a battleground of suspicion and judgment. It was a stark reminder of how a single tragedy could unravel the very fabric of a community, exposing fractures that had always been there but never spoken aloud. For Daniel's mother, every day was a torment. She had grown more frail, her steps slower, her eyes heavier with sorrow. She spoke less often, and when she did, her words carried the weight of a lifetime of disappointment and heartbreak. Yet, behind her despair, there was still a stubborn belief that her son was not the monster the world claimed him to be. She held on to fragments of his childhood: the little boy who used to bring her flowers from the yard, the teenager who stayed up late drawing superheroes, the man who once dreamed of becoming an engineer. To her, those memories could not simply vanish in the shadow of this accusation. They were proof in her heart that Daniel was more than what people were saying. Meanwhile, the prosecution was preparing with a relentless determination. They assembled every shred of evidence, no matter how thin, and built it into a story that painted Daniel as dangerous, reckless, and vengeful. The fingerprint found at the edge of the window frame, the mysterious cash deposit in his account, and the strained relationship with his sister became puzzle pieces in their carefully constructed narrative. What they lacked in concrete proof, they tried to make up for with persuasion, leaning heavily on the emotions of the jury that would one day sit in judgment. The tragedy of the murdered woman, the grief of her family, and the fear it spread throughout the town were all woven together to ensure the jurors would feel the weight of their responsibility. Daniel's defense team, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to dismantle the prosecution's case. They argued that the fingerprint could have been left during an innocent visit weeks earlier, that the cash deposit was simply a loan repayment, and that his sister's testimony was tainted by her own bitterness. But the hardest battle was not with the evidence itself. It was with perception. Once a community had painted someone as guilty, it became nearly impossible to wash that image away. Jurors were human, and humans carry biases, fears, and unspoken judgments. Daniel's attorneys knew that no matter how compelling their arguments, it would take extraordinary effort to restore even a sliver of doubt in people's minds. Amid all this, Daniel himself wrestled with the unbearable isolation of being branded as a killer. Nights in the holding cell blurred together, each hour stretching endlessly, punctuated only by the sounds of distant footsteps and the metallic clank of doors. He thought about the life he had before all of this, the simple pleasures of walking down a familiar street, laughing with friends, holding on to dreams of a future that seemed possible. Now those memories felt like they belonged to another man entirely, someone he could no longer recognize. He wondered how quickly the world had turned on him, how people he once called neighbors or friends could believe the worst without hesitation. The betrayal stung almost as much as the accusation itself. The press continued to hover, feeding on the tension like vultures circling above. News outlets portrayed Daniel in starkly different lights. Some painted him as a cold, remorseless suspect, while others hinted at the possibility of a wrongful accusation. Each article, each headline, was another nail driven into the coffin of his reputation. Reporters dug into his past, twisting mundane details into sinister patterns, while social media users became self-appointed jurors, declaring him guilty or innocent with the swipe of a finger. The court of public opinion had already sentenced him, long before the actual trial began. Through it all, there was one person who refused to give up: his childhood friend, who had stood by him from the beginning. She organized small gatherings in support of Daniel, urging others to question the inconsistencies and not be swept away by the prosecution's narrative. Though her efforts were often dismissed or ridiculed, she persisted, convinced that the truth had not yet surfaced. Her loyalty became a rare source of light in Daniel's increasingly dark world, reminding him that not everyone had abandoned him. Yet, even with her unwavering support, the reality loomed large. Daniel's future was hanging by a thread. The upcoming trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for his very identity, his place in the world, and his chance to ever live freely again. The stakes were not confined to the courtroom. They extended to his family, his reputation, and the fragile trust between himself and the community that had once embraced him. As the final days before the trial ticked by, the weight of it all grew almost unbearable. Every sunrise seemed to bring more pressure, more scrutiny, and more whispers of doubt. Daniel knew that the truth had a way of hiding in shadows, sometimes for years, sometimes forever. Whether it would come to light in time to save him was a question that haunted every breath he took. By the time the courthouse doors were set to open, both sides were ready to clash in a battle not just of facts, but of emotions, fears, and the human tendency to believe the worst in times of uncertainty. The stage was set, the audience was waiting, and Daniel's fate was about to be decided not only by the evidence, but by how deeply people were willing to look beyond their assumptions. The trial of Richard had moved at a pace that no one in the family was truly ready for. What had once been whispers, speculation, and hushed conversations over dinner tables had now transformed into stark courtroom dialogue, carried by lawyers and witnesses who spoke with both authority and unease. The once tightly woven fabric of the family had unraveled, thread by thread, leaving only fragments of loyalty scattered across the gallery. For Daisy, the ordeal felt surreal, as though she were watching her life replayed in front of strangers who held the power to decide whether her brother's deceit would finally be punished. Richard sat at the defendant's table, still wearing the aura of control he had clung to for years, but his confidence was not as solid as before. The mask cracked in small but telling ways, his restless fingers tapping against the wood, the way his eyes avoided the family members who dared to attend, and the tightening of his jaw whenever evidence was laid out in clear, irrefutable detail. Gone was the casual arrogance with which he had once dismissed everyone else's concerns. In its place stood a man who, for the first time, realized that the consequences he thought he could outrun were now firmly at his door. The prosecution's case was devastating in its precision. Documents Richard had manipulated, bank records that traced the flow of stolen money, and testimonies from colleagues who had once been too afraid to speak now created a portrait of deliberate betrayal. The narrative painted was not one of an overwhelmed man making poor decisions but of a calculating figure who had placed his greed above the well-being of those who trusted him most. Every word reinforced the reality that Richard had not stumbled into wrongdoing. He had crafted it. For Daisy, each revelation cut deeper than the last. These were not just crimes against faceless institutions or distant strangers. They were wounds inflicted on the very people who had believed in him, defended him, and carried his burdens when he faltered. The financial ruin he caused was one thing, but the emotional devastation, the shattering of bonds built over decades, was something the court could never fully measure. Watching her own family's suffering turned into legal arguments was excruciating, but she also recognized its necessity. Without this process, Richard's actions would remain shadows, whispered tragedies tucked away behind closed doors. The defense, in turn, tried to weave a story of hardship and pressure, painting Richard as a man who had fallen victim to overwhelming circumstances. They spoke of debts, personal struggles, and the heavy weight of responsibility he had shouldered. But their attempts to humanize him were constantly undercut by the evidence. Responsibility, yes, but not the kind that broke him into mistakes. Rather, it was responsibility twisted into entitlement, a belief that because he worked hard he deserved to take more than was his. The court was not fooled by the rhetoric. Outside the trial, the family's fractures widened. Some cousins still wanted to believe in Richard's innocence, clinging desperately to the image of the man they had grown up admiring. They whispered excuses, questioned the authenticity of the evidence, and even suggested conspiracies against him. Others, hardened by the relentless exposure of the truth, refused to let sentiment cloud their judgment. For them, justice was no longer negotiable. Richard had made his choices, and he needed to face the consequences. Daisy found herself torn between anger and pity, between the aching desire for accountability and the quiet mourning of the brother she had lost long before the trial began. The media attention only intensified the pressure. Headlines splashed the family's shame across newspapers and television screens, reducing years of personal pain into sensational stories designed to capture attention. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, their cameras waiting to catch glimpses of emotion from Daisy and the others. For someone who had always valued privacy, the exposure was unbearable. She could no longer walk down the street without feeling the weight of strangers' eyes, each of them holding opinions about her family's tragedy, as though it were entertainment rather than reality. Yet amidst the chaos, Daisy found strength she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to speak calmly when reporters shouted questions, to comfort her children when they cried over classmates who mocked them, and to hold her head high even when shame threatened to drag her down. The trial had taken much from her, but it had also revealed a resilience that could not be broken by betrayal. If Richard's actions had once cast her as a victim, the trial was slowly transforming her into something else, a survivor who could endure even the harshest truths. As the days turned into weeks, the trial neared its conclusion. Closing arguments loomed, and the weight of anticipation pressed heavily on everyone involved. The jury listened intently, their faces unreadable, but Daisy knew that their decision would carry more than legal weight. It would be a statement about whether betrayal within a family could ever truly be acknowledged for what it was. To convict Richard would not erase the pain, but it would at least affirm that what had been endured was real, valid, and unjust. The silence of the courtroom in those final days was unlike anything Daisy had ever experienced. Every sound, the shuffle of papers, the clearing of a throat, the click of a pen, echoed with unbearable sharpness. The air was thick with the collective breath of dozens of people waiting, wondering, fearing what would come next. Daisy sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart pounding as she thought of her parents, of the legacy Richard had tarnished, and of the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, accountability could bring a measure of peace. The jury was sent out, and with them went the fragile threads of control. Time stretched unbearably, hours passing like days as Daisy and the rest of the family sat suspended between past and future. She knew that whatever verdict they returned would mark the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. Richard's choices had already rewritten their family's story. The question now was whether justice would give them the chance to rebuild or whether the scars would remain as open wounds forever. For Daisy, the weight was agonizing, but beneath the fear was a quiet resolve. No matter what the verdict, she had already chosen her path forward. She would not let Richard's betrayal define the rest of her life. She would rise from the rubble of their broken family, carrying with her the lessons of resilience, the strength of truth, and the unshakable belief that even in the aftermath of the deepest pain, healing was still possible. The truth had finally come to light, but the aftermath was far from simple. For a family torn apart by betrayal, violence, and generational scars, there could be no easy reconciliation. The revelations had exposed not only the lies that shaped their lives, but also the destructive choices made in silence, hidden behind locked doors and guarded hearts. Healing, if it ever came, would be slow, fragile, and uncertain. Yet, despite the pain, there was a sense that surviving such darkness carried its own kind of strength. The children, once shielded by illusions, were now burdened by the weight of truth. Some would carry anger, some sorrow, and others a resolve never to repeat the mistakes of the past. The knowledge of what had been hidden from them, the betrayal, the cover-ups, the cruelty, would linger like a scar across their identities. But in that scar also lay resilience. They understood now that trust could not be given blindly, and love could not excuse harm. It was a painful lesson, but one that might keep them from falling into the same traps that ensnared those before them. The mother, though broken by the betrayals, found a strange clarity in the wreckage. Her years of silence and endurance had cost her much, but her decision to finally expose the truth brought her a measure of release. For so long she had carried the burden of protecting appearances, keeping secrets for the sake of family unity. But unity built on lies was no unity at all, it was a prison. Now that the truth had shattered the facade, she no longer had to live within those walls. What came next was uncertain, but it would be her choice, not dictated by manipulation or fear. For those who had been exposed, the consequences were heavier. Betrayal rarely comes without a price, and once lies are revealed, reputations crumble quickly. The trust they had once exploited for their own gain was gone forever, replaced by suspicion and resentment. Some faced legal consequences, others the cold rejection of loved ones who would no longer allow themselves to be fooled. The control they once held over others had slipped through their fingers, leaving only the wreckage of their schemes behind. The community, too, had been shaken. Families often believe their struggles remain private, hidden behind closed doors, but when betrayal runs deep enough, it spills out into the open, leaving everyone to witness the fallout. Neighbors, friends, and relatives were forced to confront how easily cruelty can be hidden in plain sight, disguised as normal family life. Many were left questioning how much they truly knew about the people closest to them, and how much they might have ignored simply because it was easier not to see. Yet even in this darkness there were sparks of hope. Survivors of such betrayals often find strength in speaking out, and the act of telling the story became a lifeline. By naming the pain, by exposing the lies, they took back power from those who had sought to control them. For the younger generation especially, the truth became a tool of liberation rather than despair. It allowed them to define their own futures without the weight of falsehoods dragging them backward. Forgiveness remained a complicated question. Some believed it could never be granted, certain wounds cut too deep, certain actions too unforgivable. Others held on to the idea that forgiveness, though not excusing the betrayal, could free them from being chained to bitterness. But forgiveness was not something that could be rushed. It was a journey, one that each family member had to decide for themselves whether to take. What was undeniable, however, was that the family would never be the same again. The image of perfection they once projected had crumbled, leaving behind something far more human, flawed, scarred but real. It was up to them to decide whether to rebuild or walk away, whether to cling to the broken pieces of the past or carve out a new beginning from the rubble. This story, though unique in its details, reflects a painful truth that many know too well. Betrayal often comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us. The people we trust most have the greatest power to wound us. But within that devastation lies the possibility of growth. To see the darkness clearly is to gain the chance to rise above it, to protect ourselves and to demand something better. And so, while the wounds may never fully heal, there is strength in survival. There is courage in facing the truth, no matter how ugly. And there is power in refusing to let betrayal define the rest of your life. Families can break us, but they can also teach us how to stand again. Stronger, wiser, and unwilling to accept anything less than honesty and love. And that brings us to the end of this story. Families can be our greatest source of love, but also of pain, and sometimes the hardest truths are the ones closest to home. Broken heart, if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and your story might inspire someone else to keep going. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and never stop searching for the light in the darkest places. Rose sparkles.